After my husband's death, my heart could not endure, and I fell into a coma. I could never have imagined that my own children would immediately go to court and take all my property, without thinking of the consequences. But I recovered and took everything back. When you spend more than 50 years side by side with someone, you start to believe you're stitched together. My husband and I were like that, thread through cloth, two pieces of fabric worn soft from being washed together in the same storms. I never imagined a day when he wouldn't be here. He always teased that I'd be the one to outlast him, said I was too stubborn to leave this world before my time. And I would laugh and say, well then you'd better behave or you'll leave me to do all the work. But nothing prepares you for the day the laughter stops. It was a Tuesday. Funny how grief brands dates into your memory like a hot iron. The morning was clear, the air sharp with salt from the sea. From our estate windows, the horizon glowed pale pink, a color he always said reminded him of the sails at dawn when he was still captaining the early runs of our little shipping business. I had woken early, as I always did, and put on the kettle. His mug, chipped at the rim white with faded blue stripes, sat waiting on the counter. He insisted coffee tasted better from it. I poured mine first, then his, letting the steam rise into the kitchen air. When I carried it into the sitting room, he was there in his chair by the window, the newspaper folded neatly in his lap. First I thought he had dozed off. That was something he did often these last years, nodding off mid-article with his glasses sliding down his nose. But as soon as I saw his stillness, the way his chest did not rise, I knew. I dropped the mug. Coffee splattered across the rug, but I didn't notice. My knees hit the floor, and I called his name over and over, my voice cracking like glass. I pressed my ear to his chest, slapped his cheeks, begged him to wake up, but there was only silence. The man who had once roared with laughter at his own bad jokes, who had shouted orders across docks louder than any whistle, gone without a sound. The paramedics came. Their shoes squeaked against the tile as they carried in their bags. They moved quickly, efficiently, saying words like time of death and natural causes. I stood frozen, my hands trembling against my skirt. A neighbor appeared at the door, whispering condolences I couldn't hear. The house felt full of people and yet utterly empty. By afternoon it was only me again. The chair where he'd sat was vacant, the newspaper still folded as though waiting for him to finish it. I walked from room to room in a daze. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His shoes still waited by the mat. His scent lingered in every corner, salt, leather, faint cigar smoke. Everywhere I turned he was there and yet nowhere. That night I crawled into our bed and clutched his pillow. It smelled of him, and I pressed my face into it until my tears soaked it through. I whispered prayers that I would follow him before the morning came. To live without him felt like trying to breathe with no air in the room. The days blurred. People came with casseroles, murmured kind words, patted my hand as though I were a frail creature made of glass. They didn't understand. I wasn't fragile. I was broken. Each breath hurt, and every beat of my heart felt like betrayal. How dare it keep going when his had stopped? A week later, my body finally answered the grief my spirit had been shouting. I remember standing at the top of the grand staircase, my hand gripping the polished wood of the railing. My chest tightened as though an iron band had been fastened around it. The room spun, and I heard myself cry out, though the voice sounded far away. The next instant everything went dark. They told me later it was a massive stroke. The sorrow had been too heavy, the doctor said gently, as if grief were a weight you could measure like luggage. My body had buckled beneath it, and I slipped into a coma. What does a coma feel like? It isn't sleep, not exactly. It's more like drifting in endless water. You hear fragments, footsteps, hushed voices, the beeping of machines, but you can't reach them. You want to cry out, but your lips won't move. I was trapped between this world and the next, and in that silent in-between, all I felt was the crushing absence of him. They say the heart keeps beating if there's still a reason. For a time I wasn't sure I had one. But I kept breathing though I didn't know why. And there in that stillness, in that endless dark, my shattered world waited for whatever was coming next. On that Tuesday morning when my husband left this world, mine ended too. My grief broke not just my heart but my body. I was a woman undone, lying silent while life carried on without me. And that was only the beginning. They say you can measure a marriage by what you build together. And Lord knows we built a life brick by brick, board by board, dream by dream. When I lay in that hospital bed, half in this world and half in the next, the fog of my mind would sometimes clear just long enough for me to remember. The memories didn't come in order. They arrived in fragments, sharp and bright, like photographs scattered on the floor. The first was always the docks. I can still smell the salt of the sea, mixed with the heavy grease of engines, and the sharp bite of rope burned against my hands. My husband, my Robert, started with nothing but a strong back and an iron will. He took jobs no one else wanted. Hauling crates, scrubbing decks, learning the business from the ground up while I balanced the books from our kitchen table. We were young then, so young, with nothing but a rented room above a bakery and 2 second-hand chairs we bought with borrowed money. But we had each other. Every decision we made was for someday. We scrimped and saved until we could buy our first vessel. She wasn't much. A squat little cargo boat with rust around her edges and an engine that coughed like an old smoker. But to us she was freedom. Robert named her Hope's Tide, and that's what she carried. Our hope that we could turn her into something greater. I cooked for the crew myself in those early days, stirring stew in a dented pot while waves rocked the galley. My hands blistered from scrubbing, but I never once complained. We were building something bigger than ourselves. And build we did. Each year a little more profit. Each year another vessel. By the time we'd been married 20 years, we had a fleet. Our little company grew until it became one of the largest shipping enterprises on the eastern seaboard. They called us bold. They called us lucky. But it wasn't luck. It was nights of Robert coming home with his clothes soaked through, of me falling asleep at the kitchen table with ledgers open under my cheek. It was sacrifice, sweat, and trust. Always trust. As the company grew, so did our lives. We bought the estate by the sea, a grand white house with wide porches that looked out over the Atlantic. I fell in love with it the moment we drove up the gravel path, the salt air brushing through the hydrangeas that lined the front steps. Robert said, "This is where we'll grow old." And I believed him. I can still picture him standing on that porch, sleeves rolled up, the wind catching his hair as he looked out at the horizon. That house was more than walls and a roof. It was proof that every hardship had been worth it. And then there were the cars. The cars. That was Robert's one indulgence. His boyish joy that never faded. He collected them the way some men collect stamps. Sleek convertibles, roaring muscle cars, elegant antiques polished until they shone like mirrors. We would take them out on Sunday afternoons, top down, laughter flying out behind us like ribbons. "Life is too short to drive something dull," he always said. And I would laugh, clutching my scarf against the wind, knowing that he was right. But the company, the estate, the cars, those were not the true treasures. The real wealth was the love that wove through it all. Robert and I were partners in everything. When deals fell through, when storms destroyed cargo, when banks turned us away, we leaned on each other. When success finally came, when the boardrooms opened their doors and our names began to carry weight, we celebrated not with champagne in crystal glasses but with coffee in those same chipped mugs, toasting at the kitchen table like we did in the beginning. As I drifted in that coma, I felt those moments as though I was living them again. His hand finding mine across the table, rough with calluses but steady as a rock. His voice saying, "We'll make it, you'll see." The way he danced me across the estate's wide hallway one Christmas Eve. No music but his humming. The pride in his eyes when he looked at all we had created. Not for the money, not for the power, but because it meant we had done it together. $700 million they said the company was worth in the end. 700 million. But you know, sweetheart, it wasn't the money that mattered to me as I lay there with machines humming around me. It was the story behind every dollar. The nights we worked through, the storms we survived, the dreams we refused to let go of. It was the life we built with our hands and our hearts. That was the world I saw in my drifting state. The seaside estate, the roaring cars, the fleet of ships that carried our name across oceans. And above all, Robert's face, smiling, steady, full of faith. The life we built together wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Every bit of it was born from love, and that love was what made it worth more than gold. Even in the silence of my coma, I clung to those memories. They were my anchor, my reminder that I was more than grief, more than a broken body. I was the woman who had built a life with a man she adored, and though the world had shattered, that truth could never be taken from me. When Robert and I were building our company, I always believed we were also building something else, a family. A legacy of kindness, loyalty, and respect. I told myself the ships, the estate, the cars, all of it would mean nothing if we didn't raise children who carried love in their hearts. But memory is a cruel teacher, and lying in that coma, I couldn't help but drift back to when they were small, to see the signs that I had ignored. My son was born first, and from the beginning he wanted everything for himself. He was a strong-willed boy, sharp-eyed and quick to snatch whatever was nearest. If I gave him a piece of candy, he'd gobble it down and then glare at his sister's share as if it was a personal injustice that she had one too. He never liked the word share. His fists would clench, his face would redden, and suddenly there would be tears, shouting, sometimes even scratching. My daughter came along 2 years later, softer in voice but no gentler in spirit. She had her own streak of selfishness, though hers was quieter, more calculating. If her brother grabbed the candy, she wouldn't cry. She'd wait until he wasn't looking, then sneak into his drawer and take not just one piece but the whole bag. She would hide it in her pillowcase, sticky wrappers piling up under the sheets. I remember one afternoon when they were still small, no more than 8 and 6. Robert had bought them a toy ship, painted bright red, a little reminder of the life we lived on the sea. He thought it would teach them to play together, to dream of building something side by side the way he and I had. But the moment the toy hit the floor, the fighting began. He wanted to steer. She wanted to hoist the sails. He pulled, she pushed, and before long the ship snapped in two. Robert and I stood there in the doorway, stunned. He shook his head and said, "If they can't even share a toy boat, what will they do with a real fleet one day?" I laughed it off then, thinking children outgrow such things. I told myself time would soften them. But time didn't soften, it sharpened. School brought no relief. Teachers would call, complaining that my son refused to work in groups, that he would shout others down until he got his way. My daughter, they said, was clever, but she would cheat, hide her answers, and delight in another child's failure. I made excuses. I told myself they were competitive, ambitious, driven. Perhaps that was true. But there was no generosity in it, no kindness. Even at home, holidays were battles. Easter baskets turned into skirmishes, each child counting and recounting their eggs to make sure the other had no more. At Christmas, they tore through wrapping paper with greedy hands, then spent the rest of the morning sulking, comparing, always certain the other had received more. Never once in all those years did either of them turn to Robert or me and say, "Thank you." Not once did they offer to share. I tried, Lord knows I tried. I read them stories of kindness. I made them work in the garden side by side, hoping labor would teach them cooperation. I sat them down at the kitchen table with one pie between them and told them to cut it together. Do you know what happened? One cut the pie, the other grabbed the larger slice, and they both ended up crying anyway. I remember late nights sitting up in bed whispering to Robert, "Maybe it's just a phase. Maybe when they're older they'll understand." He would sigh, rub my hand and say, "I hope you're right, my love. I hope." But deep down I think he knew just as I did that something harder was growing in them, something like hunger but darker. Years passed. They grew tall, their voices deeper, their words sharper. My son wanted to join the company early, pushing his way into boardrooms before he understood the weight of responsibility. My daughter, too, demanded her piece: clothes, cars, parties. They saw the estate not as a home but as a prize to be claimed. Robert and I still worked long hours, still poured ourselves into the business, but our children seemed to be waiting for us to grow old, waiting for us to step aside, waiting to inherit without lifting a finger. And yet, even with all the warning signs, I kept hoping. A mother's heart is foolish that way. You look at your children and you see not the selfish squabbles, but the babies you once cradled. You remember their first steps, their sleepy heads resting on your shoulder, their laughter before greed took root. I told myself again and again, they will soften. They will see the love we've given them and return it. But lying in that hospital bed, drifting in silence, those memories cut like knives. I could see so clearly how they had been from the beginning, fighting for candy, for toys, for every scrap of attention. Never sharing, never grateful. And I knew then that the children I raised were not the children I had dreamed of. They had not softened with time. They had hardened. They had grown into adults who wanted everything and gave nothing. It broke me more than the stroke itself. To realize that the empire Robert and I had built with love and sacrifice was now in the hands of two souls who had never learned the meaning of giving. That was the cruelest truth of all. There is something cruel about lying motionless, unable to open your eyes, yet hearing the shuffle of feet and whispers that tell you more than you ever wanted to know. The doctors told me later that people in comas sometimes hear things, even if they can't respond. I don't know if I truly heard their words in those first weeks, or if my heart simply imagined them, but I can tell you this. Even in the silence of that deep darkness, I felt the greed circling me. My children didn't wait for me to be lowered into the ground. No, sweetheart, they swooped down the moment my body grew still. Like vultures sensing the end before it arrives, they gathered at my bedside not to pray, not to weep, not to hold my hand, but to scheme. I remember the first time I sensed it. A hush of voices near my hospital bed. The scrape of a chair being pulled closer. My son's voice, sharp and impatient. She's not coming back from this. We need to act now. My daughter's softer but no less cruel. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be. Legally, she still has control. We need her declared incompetent. Declared incompetent. Imagine that, my dear, your own flesh and blood. The babies you raised from cradle to grown, whispering in a hospital room that you should be stripped of your rights before you've even left this earth. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't fight. I could only drift, powerless, while their words sank like stones into me. They went to court quickly, faster than I ever thought possible. The estate, the company, the cars, they were too large, too glittering for their hungry eyes to resist. $700 million worth of empire built with the sweat of my husband's brow and mine. And to them it wasn't legacy, it wasn't history. It was a prize waiting to be divided. The nurses whispered too. I heard them sometimes, voices low but heavy with pity. One said, "Her children wasted no time." Can you believe it? Dragging their own mother into court before she's even gone. Another sighed. They're already fighting over the inheritance. She doesn't even know. But I did know. My body may have been broken, but my mind somewhere deep inside was awake. I can picture it even now. The two of them sitting in courtrooms in fine clothes, polished shoes, rehearsed grief painted on their faces. They must have told the judge stories of my poor health, of my declining mind. My daughter probably dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while my son spoke of responsibility and duty. And the court, blind to the truth of their greed, listened. The irony is not lost on me. Robert and I spent our lives in courtrooms of another kind. Signing contracts, fighting competitors, defending patents, negotiating deals. We knew the power of papers and signatures, the cold weight of law. But never did I imagine that one day the same weapon we had used to build our empire would be turned against me by my own children. I lay in the hospital bed, machines breathing for me, and felt their claws tearing at the flesh of my life. They spoke of assets, of divisions, of what was fair. But there was nothing fair about it. It was hunger, plain and simple. Hunger that had lived in them since childhood, now unmasked in its full ugliness. They circled not only the company but the estate. I can almost hear them arguing. Who would take the seaside house, who would claim which wing, who would sell the cars. My son no doubt wanted the classics, those shining convertibles Robert loved. My daughter, I'm sure, saw herself hosting grand parties in the estate, sweeping through the halls as though she had earned them. But none of it was theirs. Not yet. I was still alive. I was still breathing, however faintly. And yet they treated me as though I had already been buried, as though my presence in this world was nothing more than a legal inconvenience to be tidied away. I used to think grief was the hardest burden a mother could bear. Losing Robert nearly killed me. But as I floated in that endless half-sleep, I realized there was something worse, betrayal. To know that the children I carried, the ones I sacrificed for, were waiting like predators for my last breath. That was a cruelty deeper than death. The vultures circled, their wings casting shadows over everything Robert and I had built. They whispered in courtrooms, signed papers, smiled thinly as they stripped me of the rights I had earned with a lifetime of work. And I, their mother, could do nothing but lie still, listening, burning with the faint ember of rage that even a coma could not smother. One day I promised myself if I ever opened my eyes again, if I ever stood on my own 2 feet, I would not forget. I would not forgive. The day my children walked out of that courthouse with papers in their hands, I may as well have been buried. At least that's how they treated me. I was still breathing, still lying in that hospital bed with machines humming around me. But in their minds I no longer existed. They had one. The court declared me legally incompetent. Those were the words. Cold, clinical and final. My voice silenced, my rights stripped away, my life's work passed like a deed to strangers. Except these strangers were the very children I had carried into this world. The empire Robert and I had built, the ships, the estate, the cars, every dollar and every memory tied to them, all of it signed over into their hands. I picture them that day. My son standing tall, chest puffed out as if he'd conquered something. My daughter, her lips pressed in that smug little smile she's worn since childhood whenever she thought she'd won a fight. They probably shook hands with their lawyers, nodded gravely, pretended this was all about responsibility and stewardship. But make no mistake, sweetheart, this was no act of duty. This was victory. To them it was the spoils of war, and the battlefield had been their own mother. And once they held it, once the ink dried and the company, the estate, and the fleet of cars were placed in their care, the fighting began. Because greed, you see, is never satisfied. They thought taking it from me would be enough, but greed does not rest. My son wanted control of the company outright, certain that his business degree and loud voice made him the rightful heir. My daughter, on the other hand, wanted the estate, the cars, the jewelry, everything glittering and beautiful that she could display like trophies. They quarreled from the first day, their voices carrying through the halls of courtrooms and into board meetings. I imagine them sitting across a polished table, papers spread out like weapons, each one accusing the other of unfairness. My son would pound his fist, claiming he had the vision to lead the shipping company into its next chapter. My daughter would sneer, reminding him that she had the charm, the connections, the ability to turn an estate into a palace of power. Both of them forgetting that none of it was theirs to begin with. And so the estate that Robert and I filled with laughter turned into a battleground. Every car in the garage became a point of argument. That one was promised to me. No, father meant it for me. The seaside property itself nearly tore them apart. They fought over the view from the master bedroom, over who would host the holiday parties, over which of their names would be etched on the gates. It wasn't about legacy. It wasn't even about money, not really. It was about pride. About winning. All the while I lay silent as though already gone, while the two of them fought like jackals over the bones of a feast. The company suffered for it too. They may have thought they were capable of running it, but they were children playing at power. They brought their quarrels into the boardroom, bickering in front of executives who had once looked at Robert with respect. Deals stalled, shipments fell behind, clients grew wary. The empire we had built with sweat and sacrifice was suddenly at the mercy of two spoiled heirs who cared more about besting each other than honoring the business itself. And still they were not ashamed. They paraded their victory to anyone who would listen. My son began touring the docks, barking orders at men who had once worked beside his father, men who saw right through him. My daughter threw parties at the estate, showing off the chandeliers and the marble floors as though she had polished them with her own two hands. They basked in the glow of stolen triumph, blind to the truth that their empire was crumbling beneath them. What stung most of all, even more than their greed, was their lack of mourning. Not once did they pause to honor the man who had built it all. Not once did they speak of Robert with reverence. My husband, who had given his body to the sea, who had risen from nothing to build a $700 million empire, was reduced in their eyes to a stepping stone. His death was not a wound to them, it was an opportunity. And me? I was nothing. A shadow in a hospital bed. In their minds, I had already been written out of the story. The papers said incompetent, and so incompetent I was. Their lawyers had carved me out like a line of text scratched away from a will. But inside I burned. Oh, sweetheart, if you had seen the fire that smoldered in me, even as my body lay still. For every laugh they shared over their new riches, for every argument over who would take what, I stored it away. I stored the betrayal, the shame, the utter disregard they had shown. I tucked it into my heart like fuel waiting for a match. The court had betrayed me, yes. My children had betrayed me, yes. But I was not gone. I was still here. And if the Lord allowed me to rise again, they would see that the story was not finished. For now, though, all I could do was lie silent while my children celebrated their victory, squabbling over riches, blind to the truth that their mother was not yet done. The world did not come rushing back in one dramatic sweep like you see in those moving pictures. No. It returned to me in fragments. Light first, too bright and stinging against my eyelids. Then sound. The steady beep of a machine, the shuffle of rubber soles across linoleum. The hushed voices of nurses who thought I was still gone to the world. I opened my eyes slowly, not out of weakness but out of instinct. I wanted to listen before anyone knew I was awake. My body was stiff, heavy as stone, but my mind was sharp. I remember the first voice I heard clearly. A doctor standing at the foot of my bed. He thought I was still adrift in that endless darkness, but I caught his words as if they had been spoken directly into my ear. "She survived," he said softly, as if even he couldn't quite believe it. "But it won't matter much. Her children wasted no time. They've already taken everything. Court declared her incompetent. Company estate, all of it gone." Another voice answered, a younger doctor, weary but kind. "It's a shame. She built it all. And now they're fighting over it like scraps. She doesn't even know what's been done to her." But I did know. Oh, sweetheart, I knew. Their words cut through the haze like a blade. My children, my son, my daughter, the same ones I had nursed through fevers, the same ones I had carried and prayed over, they had gone to court while I still breathed. They had stolen my life while my heart was still beating. I lay perfectly still, my eyelids heavy, but inside I was burning. When the doctors left, the nurses came. I could hear them too, fussing over machines, adjusting my blankets, whispering to one another. "She's strong," one said. "Stronger than anyone thought." And I wanted to laugh, though my throat could not yet form the sound. Strong, that word had carried me through every storm of my life. It would carry me now. The hours bled into days. My body began to stir, small movements first. The twitch of a finger, the flutter of an eyelid. Each effort was agony, as though I were pushing against chains, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me I was still here, still alive, and that meant I could still fight. And while I struggled, I thought of them, my children. I pictured them sitting in the estate parlor, their voices raised in argument, tallying cars and properties as though they were poker chips. I imagined them raising glasses in toast, celebrating their victory, certain that their mother was finished. How wrong they were. When the nurses realized I was conscious, there was a flurry of activity. Doctors came rushing, shining lights into my eyes, testing my reflexes. Their faces were full of astonishment. "Remarkable," one murmured. "After a stroke like that, recovery should be near impossible. But look at her." I wanted to tell them, "You don't know the fire that fuels me. Anger is a powerful medicine, stronger than any drug they could pump into my veins. Betrayal can lift a body out of the grave if it's fierce enough." Soon they allowed me to speak. My voice was weak at first, a hoarse whisper. But with every word my strength returned. I asked simple questions: how long I had been asleep, what day it was, how my health fared. They answered with careful optimism. But not one of them dared tell me the whole truth about my children. They didn't have to. I had already heard enough. At night, when the halls quieted and the machines hummed like a low lullaby, I would lie awake, planning. My children thought they had one. They thought the law was on their side. But the law had always been my tool as much as theirs. Robert and I built our empire with contracts and signatures, with shrewd decisions and sharper lawyers. And if I lived long enough to walk out of that hospital, I would use those same tools to take back what was mine. One evening, a nurse leaned close to adjust my pillow. She whispered, perhaps thinking I was still too weak to understand. "Your children don't even visit anymore," she said softly. "Not since the court ruling. They got what they wanted." I closed my eyes, not from pain, but to hide the smile that tugged at my lips. Let them believe I was beaten. Let them celebrate their theft. It would make my return all the sweeter. Awakening, you see, was more than opening my eyes. It was opening my heart to a new truth. My children were not my heirs. They were my enemies. And I was not finished yet. They said I was lucky to even be alive. The stroke had been severe, the coma long. By all accounts, I should have been nothing more than a shell of myself. But I wasn't lucky. I was furious. And fury, my dear, can do what medicine cannot. Rehabilitation was no gentle thing. My body was stiff, my muscles wasted. The first time they asked me to stand, I thought my legs were made of stone. They shook under me, weak and trembling, but I forced them down against the floor. The therapist beside me urged patience. "One step at a time," she said. But she didn't understand. I wasn't fighting just to walk again, I was fighting for justice. I had a company to reclaim, a home to defend, a legacy to protect. My children thought they had buried me, but I was digging my way back to the light, one painful breath at a time. Every exercise became a battle. My arms strained against resistance bands. My breath grew ragged, climbing even a single step. My voice cracked as I forced it to grow stronger with speech therapy. But each small victory was sweeter than gold. Each step forward whispered, "You are not beaten yet." I would close my eyes during those sessions and see Robert. His memory became my silent coach. I could almost hear his voice. "Push, love. Harder. Don't you dare give in." He had never given in to storms at sea or setbacks in business, and I would not give in now. And when the pain grew too sharp, when sweat stung my eyes and my body cried out for rest, I thought of my children. I thought of their smug faces in that courtroom, their greedy hands reaching for what was not theirs, their laughter as they imagined their mother finished. That anger lit a fire in me hotter than any fever. I welcomed the pain then, it was fuel. Every ache, every strain, every stumble reminded me of what I was fighting for. The nurses marveled at my progress. "You're healing faster than we expected," they said. "Most patients in your condition would still be bedridden." I smiled faintly but said nothing. They didn't know my secret. I was healing not out of hope but out of defiance. My body was rebuilding itself on the bricks of betrayal. And with each day I grew stronger, so did my resolve. There were nights, though, when the anger softened into sorrow. Alone in my hospital bed, I would weep quietly into my pillow. Not for the estate, not for the cars, not even for the company, but for the children I thought I had raised. How had my love failed them so completely? Where had kindness slipped through my fingers, replaced by greed? Those questions haunted me. But every time I felt sorrow drag me down, I reminded myself, I could mourn later. For now I had to fight. After weeks I was walking again, slow but steady. My speech returned clear and firm. I could hold a pen, write my name, the very one they had tried to erase from papers and contracts. Seeing it in ink gave me strength. I wasn't gone. I was still here. And soon I would take back what was mine. One afternoon, as I managed a short walk down the hospital corridor, I passed by a television in the waiting room. On the screen was a news segment about my company, their company now, though hearing it phrased that way felt like a knife. The anchor spoke of new leadership, of transitions, of sibling disputes slowing operations. My children's names scrolled across the bottom. I stopped dead in my tracks. There it was, plain for all the world to see. They were already tearing it apart. The empire Robert and I had bled for was cracking under their greed. That night, lying awake, I vowed aloud, my voice no more than a whisper. You will not destroy us. You will not win. The doctors called my recovery a miracle. But it wasn't heaven that raised me, it was betrayal. My children's treachery had done what no surgeon's knife or pill could do. It gave me purpose. It gave me the strength to crawl back from the edge of death itself. When at last the doctors placed a certificate of health in my hands, declaring me competent, strong, alive, I felt something deep in my chest, something like triumph. It wasn't the end of my battle, no. It was only the beginning. For now, though, I held my victory close. Quiet. Hidden. My children still thought me weak, still believed their theft had gone undiscovered. Let them. I was patient. I was steady. And I was coming for them. Revenge, my dear, cannot be rushed. It must be prepared like a fine meal, slowly, carefully, with every ingredient measured and every flame watched. One wrong move and it burns. One hasty step and it spoils. When the doctors finally placed that certificate of health in my hands, stamped and signed, I felt the weight of it as if it were a weapon. It was proof that I was not incompetent, proof that I was whole. Still, I did not rush into the light with it raised above my head. No. I tucked it away, safe and hidden, and I began to prepare. The first thing I needed was silence. My children still thought I was weak, frail, a mother whose only business was to shuffle around the estate in slippers until the grave welcomed her. They didn't know I was watching. They didn't know I was planning. So I let them believe their lie. I didn't call them. I didn't announce my recovery. Not a word. Let them think I was still convalescing, dependent, incapable. The longer they thought me powerless, the less guarded they would be. Then came the lawyers. Robert and I had always kept a circle of trusted advisors around us, men and women who had been with us since the early days, who knew the company, the contracts, the law as well as we did. Many had retired, but some still practiced. And when I reached out, quiet and deliberate, they came. I remember the first meeting, early morning, in a private office downtown. I walked in with my cane tapping against the polished floor, my back straighter than it had been in months. Their eyes widened when they saw me, alive and strong. One man, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward and said, "We thought we'd lost you." "Not yet," I answered. "And not before I set this right." We sat for hours poring over documents. Contracts, wills, medical records, court transcripts, all the tools my children had used to strip me of my rights. The lawyers explained how my children had painted me in court. A frail old woman, incapacitated, incapable of managing her own life. They had used my stroke as proof, my coma as evidence. And the judge, blind to their greed, had agreed. But the law, as Robert and I always knew, is a two-edged blade. What can be used to cut you down can also be turned to cut your enemies. And I had one thing they didn't expect: my recovery. Competent, certified, undeniable. That piece of paper would be the torch that lit my way back to power. We began to build the case quietly, brick by brick. Affidavits from doctors confirming my recovery. Statements from nurses who whispered about the greed of my children. Evidence of the company's decline under their so-called leadership. And woven through it all the undeniable truth. I was alive, I was healthy, and I was ready to reclaim what was mine. The lawyers cautioned patience. We must move carefully, they said. If your children catch wind of this too soon, they'll bury us in countersuits. I know, I replied. That's why they must know nothing, until it is too late. And so I kept my secret. Outwardly I lived quietly. I attended my therapy sessions, took short walks along the shore, visited the small chapel near the estate where Robert and I once prayed together. If anyone asked, I was simply an old woman grateful to be alive, content to live out her days in peace. But behind closed doors, I was a general sharpening her sword. I thought often of Robert in those days. He had always said, "Never fight a battle unprepared. The sea will swallow the careless." I carried his words with me like scripture. Each night, as I reviewed the day's progress with my lawyers, I whispered to him, "We are not finished yet, love. Not yet." Meanwhile, my children carried on in ignorance. They hosted parties, flaunted their new roles, argued endlessly over cars and contracts. Their arrogance was my shield. So busy with their bickering, they never once thought to look over their shoulders. And in their arrogance, they left cracks wide enough for me to slip through. I collected stories from the company's employees, men and women who had worked under Robert and me for decades. They told me how my son stormed into meetings unprepared, how my daughter treated the company coffers like her personal purse. I gathered every word, every misstep, and added it to my growing arsenal. I was no longer just a widow grieving her husband or a mother betrayed by her children. I was a strategist preparing for war. And the battlefield would not be the docks, nor the estate halls, nor even the company boardroom. No, the battlefield would be court. The very place they thought they had defeated me. Quietly, patiently, I laid my plans. Each day of silence was another stone laid in the foundation of my revenge. Each moment of secrecy was another stitch in the net I would cast over them. And when the day came when I walked into that courtroom once more, they would not be facing the frail old mother they thought they had buried. They would be facing a storm. The morning of the hearing I dressed with care. Not in mourning black, nor in the muted grays of sickness. No, I chose a deep blue suit, the color of the sea where Robert had built our first fortune. I pinned my hair back neatly, clasped my pearls around my neck, and slipped on the sensible heels I hadn't worn in years. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a widow or a stroke victim. I saw a woman returning to battle. The courthouse was familiar. Robert and I had walked those halls many times, signing contracts, settling disputes, defending what was ours. But this time was different. This time I was walking in alone, or so it appeared. In truth, I carried him with me, every lesson, every sacrifice. Inside, the courtroom buzzed. My children were already there, seated at their polished table, lawyers flanking them like soldiers. My son looked smug, tapping his pen against the folder in front of him. My daughter wore her usual mask of sweetness, lips curved in a smile that never touched her eyes. They hadn't been warned. They thought today was routine. Then the bailiff announced me. When I walked through those doors, cane tapping steadily, the air shifted. My children froze. My daughter's mouth fell open before she caught herself. My son's face drained of color, then flushed red with anger. Their lawyers turned, blinking in shock, as though they had seen a ghost. I moved slowly but with dignity, every step measured, every glance deliberate. I took my place at my own table, my panel of lawyers behind me, and sat tall. The silence in that moment was sweeter than any hymn. The judge entered and proceedings began. My children's lawyers scrambled, stammering as they tried to make sense of my presence. My son leaned toward his sister, whispering furiously. She hissed back, her mask slipping. For the first time, cracks appeared between them in public. When my attorney rose to speak, the room listened. He presented the certificate of my full recovery, signed by the very doctors who had once testified against me. He read affidavits from nurses, from longtime employees, from those who had witnessed my children's greed and neglect. He laid out the decline of the company under their control, the squandered profits, the constant quarrels. Piece by piece, he rebuilt me in the eyes of the court, not as an invalid, but as the rightful head of my estate and empire. My children tried to protest. My son shouted about family duty. My daughter wept crocodile tears, insisting she had only ever wanted what was best for me. But the courtroom had seen enough. Their fighting turned on each other, accusations flying back and forth, about money spent, promises broken, debts hidden. Their unity shattered in front of everyone. I sat quietly through it all, my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. I didn't need to raise my voice. I had already won by standing there, alive, strong, undeniable. When the judge finally struck the gavel, ruling in my favor, I closed my eyes for just a moment. Not in relief, no, I had never doubted this day would come. I closed them to feel Robert beside me, to hear his voice whisper, "Well done, love. Well done." And as my children sat in their chairs, pale and defeated, I rose, cane steady in my hand, and walked out of that courtroom with the dignity they had tried so hard to strip from me. The day after the court ruling, I woke to the sound of the sea outside my window. The tide rolled in steady, patient, eternal, just as it always had. For the first time in months, I breathed without heaviness. Justice had been done. The estate was mine again. The company, too. The cars slept in their garages, polished and waiting. It was as though the house itself sighed in relief, welcoming me home. My children, stripped of their stolen power, had scattered like frightened birds. I did not chase them. Let them live with the shame of what they had tried to do. My battle was not for their hearts anymore. My battle had been for mine. I decided that very morning I would not spend another day in shadows. I put on my brightest scarf, one Robert had bought me on a trip to Italy, and walked out to the garage. There, gleaming in the morning sun, was the cherry-red convertible he loved most. I slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and felt the engine roar to life. With the top down and the wind whipping through my hair, I drove straight to the golf course. Robert and I used to play there on Sundays, teasing each other over who could land closer to the hole. I parked the car, stepped onto the green, and lifted my face to the sun. I wasn't playing for score that day. I was playing for him. For us. For every storm we had weathered. For every betrayal I had overcome. For the sweet taste of freedom. Each swing sent a ball sailing into the blue sky, and with every strike I felt lighter. As the sun set over the water, I stood tall on that course, my heart steady. I had lost much, my husband, my illusions about my children, but I had not lost myself. Victory is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, like the hum of an engine, the crack of a golf ball, or the sound of waves against the shore. And in that quiet, I found my new beginning. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.